All right. Well, I think this thing is going along the way I intended. So this recording is being made for our scheduled class topic um, on Monday, April 13th. So most of you will probably be watching this at that time, which is fine. I hope that you had a blessed and productive Easter weekend. Hope you were able to spend time with your families and obviously hope that you're all doing well and that you're healthy and all the rest. We seem to be doing okay here, even for an introvert like me. I'm starting to get a little bit stir crazy, spending 99.9% of my time inside my house. I went for a drive in my Bullitt Mustang around town for just a short time on Saturday afternoon and got myself an espresso while I was out there, and that's really the extent of me being outside wandering around right now. But it sure was fun getting my car up to speed and um, and going faster than I'll admit right now. But anyway, I hope you're all doing well and hope that you're making it through all this craziness. So this isn't going to be quite as long. The previous two were a little bit longer than I actually was aware of when I was recording, so I apologize. The one was just like an hour and 5 minutes or something. It was longer than I anticipated, but this one will be a little bit shorter, probably more like, in fact, 35, 40 minutes at the most. But it is really important because I wanted to leave time for the films of the 1990s. That decade is actually one of the most productive in Western English language film. And so it just required a little bit more time, a little bit more devotion. And I wanted to take that time. So we've been working through the 1990s. I've gotten all your reviews so that you've all been submitting. And I think you're up to speed with that. So before I forget, just a couple of other announcements, just kind of, making sure we're on the same page regarding upcoming work. So obviously we're going to have our time regarding the 21st century films coming up that I'll be starting on Wednesday the 15th, and then we'll make it through those couple decades, and then you guys will have your greatest your greatest director critiques that you compose and submit to me, and that will be essentially kind of like your final exam that you'll submit in a Microsoft Word document to me. So those are the major assignments coming up. I just did want to remind you, though, first and foremost, there are still going to be a couple decades of students who were in their original groups that are now doing these independent 5-minute video segments that they post on YouTube and then I post on Converge. So remember, if you have been part of a group and you have not gone yet, you still have that requirement. I think that's pretty clear at this point, but I'm still missing some submissions. And to be quite honest with you, I don't have the time or energy to track everybody down and beat them over the head to do that. So if you don't submit your group presentation video, if you don't submit that individual video and you don't do that assignment, obviously you lose out on those points. So there are some students right now who are facing that reality. Most of you have not failed to do that, so I appreciate it. I know it was an adjustment for all of you, but you've been doing some really nice work, and I appreciate that. So thanks for taking the time and for doing that assignment. The other assignment that I did want to mention in passing was the extra credit assignment that I talked about all the way back in February, I believe. Maybe it was even January. So remember that if you want a maximum of 15 points extra credit, you need to watch the Scorsese film Silence about Jesuit priests in Japan in the 17th century. And then you also need to watch the more recent film that just came out in December of 2019 that was just released in theaters in December of 2019 called A Hidden Life by Terrence Malick. And I want you to watch those both, and then I want you to provide me with a comparative critique of those films, specifically in light of the theology that they are both presenting, the idea of whether it's possible to just know you're a Christian in your heart, but not have any of that fruit showing around you, and to deny that you worship the Savior in public and then claim it in private, if that's actually something that seems theologically sound and possible. Very complex issue, there's no doubt about that, but that's essentially the take that's put forward in the Silence film by Scorsese, albeit in very difficult circumstances, under persecution and extreme duress and all the other things that you'll see in that film, versus the other observation, the other approach in A Hidden Life, in which the protagonist in that film decides that he's going to declare himself regardless, and that means that he'll declare himself regardless of what comes, what the consequences of that declaration may be, and regardless of whether there is widespread public recognition that he is making this show of dedication to Christ or what have you. And it's a very powerful film. So I want you to watch those two and then provide me with your comparative critique. Those critiques are due, those extra credits are due no later than Friday, April 24th. So, and obviously it's up to you. It is not an assignment that you are mandated to accomplish, but it is an option for you if you choose to, okay? Anyway, all right, let's move on and talk about a few more films. So we've moved through quite a few, and I was in the midst of talking a little bit about some action, suspense dramas of various kinds, and I kind of merged into a slide here. So some of them are psychological thrillers, some of them are just straightforward action pieces, some of them have more of a political undertone to them. There are also some crime dramas that are mixed in here as well, some crime or gangster dramas. So each of the films that you see here, I think, has merit. One that I've kind of joked about previously that is certainly not a film that would be on anyone's all-time great list, but one that I've enjoyed and still go back to on occasion is Point Break. So I don't know if that one deserves to be on this screen or not, but I put it there, and I'm teaching the course, so I'm allowed to. So it's there. These others are highly regarded films, both very much appreciated by audiences, but also by the critics, and the ones that kind of stand out in these genres over the course of the 1990s. And we've covered actually a few of them already here and there. I love, by the way, the political thriller that's based on the Tom Clancy novel, The Hunt for Red October. Phenomenally well done, very clever in the sequencing, a John McTiernan film that I think he really hit out of the ballpark. The film that he'd done previously in the 1980s was Die Hard, and so McTiernan takes hold of another major project and just kills it. Really, really good film. And very difficult to make a complex political thriller novel into a cohesive storyline in a film. And although there was some compressing with the story, it's very well done. I would highly recommend it if you have not seen it already. A number of other films, The Fugitive, actually based on a TV show from a couple decades earlier, with the protagonist played by Harrison Ford. Another very well done film. In the Line of Fire, similarly. These are all very good drama, action, suspense pieces. A film that got a lot of attention, and rightly so, in 1997 was a film called L.A. Confidential, kind of a throwback film to Los Angeles in the 1940s, and kind of bringing together some interesting story plots in that particular film. A lot of really good performances in that. It's a crime drama, very effectively done. A very young Russell Crowe kind of gets a lot of screen time there, and his performance got him a lot of accolades, and actually I think helped to secure some of his successive roles, not the least of which was his role as Maximus in Gladiator that came a few years later. The film that I want to talk about for a minute here is actually going to help me introduce a director remind you of a director that you may be aware of, and that is Michael Mann. So Michael Mann was designing and plotting and producing a couple of TV shows and commercials in the 1980s. It's actually, he got his start in the commercial industry and then went into television. And his big breakout came when he was one of the key producers for a very really avant-garde cop show that came out in 1984 called Miami Vice. I suspect you've heard of the show, maybe you've even seen it. If you watch it in the year 2020, it almost seems outlandishly strange and cheesy primarily because of the strange wardrobes of these vice cops in Miami in the mid 1980s. Almost looks like they're wearing pajamas. Especially the Sonny Crockett character played by Don Johnson. But it was it really caught audiences off guard. It was a very serious drama show, but of course it's framed in a much more exotic location, South Florida and Miami, not far from the Caribbean, very different kind of culture in that part of the United States. And the whole concept of the show, these two cops who are undercover cops actually, who are helping to locate and to bring to justice a number of different offenders who are smuggling drugs into the United States and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, the thing that really set the show apart was Michael Mann's integration of these urban scapes. And if you ever watch Miami Vice, if you were to go back and watch an episode or two, that's one of the things that you would note. He was very skilled even from the early point in that show with having his directors, his guest directors who came in and did some of the shows, making sure that a lot of the shot framing was both daytime and nighttime, and that there was an awful lot of integration of up-to-date, at that point in time, up-to-date music. So music that was topping the charts at that time, which in the mid 1980s was mostly, pop rock kind of music. So anyway, it was kind of got him to be catapulted to fame at that point, and he allows him to bankroll some of his own creative projects. And from Miami Vice, he begins to take some stepping stones into the film industry. And Michael Mann, although he hasn't been directing one film every 2 or 3 years, he's been a little bit slower than that. His films have been, typically anyway, they've been very highly regarded. So one of the first films he did was in 1988, I believe, and it was actually the first film version that dealt with the character Hannibal Lecter. He went from there, and in 1992 was hailed as kind of one of the new film directors in the industry that was pursuing the art at a very high level for his film, The Last of the Mohicans, the take on the classic James Fenimore Cooper novel, starring Daniel Day-Lewis in the title role as Hawkeye, and Madeline Stowe playing the love interest in the film. A very, very good film, but also from a cinematography perspective, an absolutely gorgeous film with a beautiful integration of soundtrack, the film score, and actually tells the story beautifully and well. And he goes from there to take on, I think, one of the greatest crime dramas of the last 40 or 50 years, a film called Heat, starring Al Pacino and Robert De Niro in the two key roles in the film. They're antagonists in the film. One, the Pacino character, Vincent Hanna, plays a robbery homicide detective in Los Angeles, and De Niro plays a very high-end bank robber. Or if not just a bank robber, a very high-end thief. He and his crew knock down these, whether it's a bank or some sort of industry mogul, they're taking these scores. And so these two characters are playing a cat and mouse game throughout the story. It's about a 3-hour film, and it's a very actually tightly woven plot, very well carried off. There's not a moment in those 3 hours where you're not really engaged and really hanging on the edge of your seat, waiting for the next moment to swing by on the screen. So and you see in Heat, a lot of Miami Vice fans immediately saw, you know, uh, the carryover from what Michael Mann had overseen in the Miami Vice television series. You see parts of that coming to fruition in Heat. Very effective set pieces with this urban drama, using the urbanscapes to great effect in the film. Both the buildings themselves, the locations that you know, anyone who's ever been to LA can recognize, integrating nighttime scenes very effectively, but also bringing these characters and shockingly, I think, rounding them out and making them far more than these one-dimensional passing characters. Even some of the minor characters in the story, you really connect with. Even some of the villain characters in the story, you connect with, and it's just a phenomenally well done film. And most audiences, you know, were flocking to see this movie. There were some really good informed critics who also loved the film and proclaimed, you know, its many merits to anyone who would listen. But for strange reasons, the Academy, right? So the members of the Hollywood Film Academy who host the Oscars, right? They just you know, they didn't take it as seriously as they should have. It has weathered time very well, even more so than when it first came out in 1995. The film Heat is now revered as one of the greatest crime dramas, certainly of the last few decades, and probably going back way further than that to being one of the greatest film dramas or crime dramas of all time. So I posted 2 links on that film, and I think you'll really appreciate, if you watch the film entirely, you'll see what I'm talking about with Michael Mann's direction and the cinematography and the integration of music and all these things. There's a great moment in the film where film fans for decades have been wanting these 2 great actors, Pacino and De Niro, to share a screen together in an actual sequence. So, you know, Pacino and De Niro had, going back to the 1970s, right? So something like The Godfather Part 2, both men were actors in the film, but they were not actually in any sequences together in that film. And so here you have these guys who have crossed paths over the years, and their careers have spanned, you know, almost the identical time period. And they're both very well known for crime dramas and gangster films, and yet they haven't spent any time together on screen for audiences to watch them. And in this film, it finally happened. And it's a fascinating scene in which the detective, Vincent Hanna, again played by Pacino, he comes in and he actually flags down the De Niro character named Neil McCauley, and he tells him, "Hey, I want to talk to you. Let's go and get some coffee." And so they go to this coffee shop at nighttime, and they sit down and they have this really interesting conversation. And it's just, the tension is in the air. You're kind of wondering the whole time, what's this detective doing? Isn't he just going to arrest the guy on the spot? But they just don't have the evidence they need yet. So that isn't actually the Pacino character's purpose. So Detective Hanna basically wants to fire some warning shots and let him know that he's under suspicion and that they're coming after him. And there's just a really fascinating interaction in that coffee shop. That's the first link I posted. And the second one I want you to be aware of is one of the most famous urban, if you want to call it urban warfare scenes. Doesn't deal with military issues, but it deals with these cops who are made aware of a bank robbery that's taking place, and they show up and try to take down the De Niro character and his crew as they're exiting a bank. And what ensues is this very famous combat scene between the police in LA and this small crew of bank robbers trying to make their escape. And it was reshot several times. It was so convincing. I mean, a lot of even some of the businesses and the residents in LA, even though all this stuff was cordoned off when they were shooting, they were just kind of blown away by all of the authenticity that was involved. There were people actually calling the police, claiming there was a shootout. They weren't watching carefully, obviously, given all the film cameras. But you know, what have you? People are stupid. What you going to do about it? So that's the sequence. I do want you to understand it's obviously very violent. So you don't want to, if you're concerned about that, please don't click the link and don't watch that sequence. But it is a very well done sequence. It is very convincing, very realistic, and just also brilliantly staged. So I think you'd appreciate that. Okay. Some comedy films. So we haven't talked about many comedies in either the 80s or 90s. I have touched on a few here and there. And man, there are some really good ones in the 90s. I want to just make you aware of that. One that I know that, you know, those who have watched some of the mockumentaries going back to This Is Spinal Tap probably are aware of Christopher Guest and his crew making the film Waiting for Guffman. It's kind of a off, kind of a screwball, kind of off and strange approach to comedy, but his comedy team does a really fun job with that film. It's actually very funny. Galaxy Quest I love because it is very much, it both pays homage, of course, to Star Trek, but takes things in their own unique direction. And so there is some definite satire there, and yet it's also very creative in its own right, and just great performances across the board from the entire cast, headed by Tim Allen, Sigourney Weaver, and as you can see here, the late Alan Rickman. Just absolutely hilarious, top-notch comedy. Office Space has garnered a lot more of attention than when it first came out. It kind of floated by the radar, and many people didn't see it in the theaters initially, but it grew in notoriety as more people watched it once it came out on video, and now it has this cult following across this country and across other parts of the world too. And it's a very clever film, basically bringing to light, you know, all the realities of life that many working professionals feel as they relate to their co-workers and their bosses, and the feelings of futility and frustration. For me, the first time I saw Office Space, the first thing that came to mind was that this was very much like the comic strip Dilbert come to the screen. Just the interactions between these office workers, and how they're often mocking one another, and how the employees just can't stand the inept bosses for whom they work. And boy, it's very cleverly done. Two other films I want to mention before I talk about Clueless. So Dumb and Dumber is often you know, kind of dismissed as, you know, just stupid comedy, and it is stupid comedy. There's no doubt that both Jim Carrey and Jeff Daniels, their characters are complete idiots, and that's kind of the point. It is idiot comedy at its very best. It's kind of like going back and watching, you know, Jerry Lewis, and you know, some of the Jerry Lewis comedies of the 1950s. It's not really screwball in the same sense as some of the older films from the 30s and 40s, but there are some elements of that stupid humor certainly involved. There's a lot of junior high school boy humor, certainly, right? So, you know, toilet humor, we might call that. That is certainly a part of the film, but it actually is, you know, I was surprised first time I saw it. I wasn't really sure what to expect, but it's very funny. It is very simple. There's nothing that's overly complex that's going to catch you off guard properly, but it is still one of those, you know, idiot comedies from the 1990s that was actually pretty well staged and performed. Both of those actors, Jim Carrey, who was at that time known almost entirely for his comedic roles, he is actually quite funny in that particular film. Tommy Boy is another one, and I mention it because you know, we no longer have the brilliant comedic charms of Chris Farley because of his untimely death way too early from both alcohol and drug abuse. And this is one of those films that, you know, I'm not sure I would mark it as somewhere in the greatest comedies of all time sort of a deal, but it is certainly a film that deserves a fair amount of attention because it does showcase just the wit and the the fun, pleasurable performances of Chris Farley, and he's just really, really funny in that film. I'm not going to spoil too much of the basic plot lines for you, but I think you'll appreciate it if you ever get a chance to watch it. It is a very well crafted film. The one I want to focus on quickly is Clueless, and the reason is this. It's a film by one of the directors, one of the female directors that doesn't get as much attention as I think she probably should. Worked on films like Fast Times at Ridgemont High is another great film. Her name is Amy Heckerling, and she and her screenwriters and her production crew take the Jane Austen novel, which was a comedic romantic novel called Emma, which many of you are probably aware of, and they decided to take that storyline and put a modern, or at that time, a 1990s spin on the Emma story. And this is a cast through like these high schoolers, right, at this LA, this posh Beverly Hills high school or Beverly Hills area high school, and just turning everything into very, very clever, both ironic and satirical comedy put to the screen very effectively. Stars a very young Alicia Silverstone in a role that probably still she'll be known for this role probably throughout her life. It's the one that really catapulted her to a brief period of stardom and fame as an actress. She's obviously not in many films anymore, so it was relatively fleeting. But Alicia Silverstone is actually just hilarious and great in this role as Cher. And Amy Heckerling and the screenwriters did a great job of integrating a lot of the realities of teen life. It's actually sort of like an updated version of a John Hughes film for LA in the mid 1990s, and it is very cleverly done. So I put a sequence from that film on the website, and I think you'll appreciate it. A lot of famous lines, a lot of quotable lines from that film that continue to this day. Very funny, very good acting. Paul Rudd is in there, plays her stepbrother, and ultimately love interest in the film. And Brittany Murphy is in it, the late Brittany Murphy. She is another actress who died way too young. So she's in the film, early stage of her career. And I think you'll appreciate the link. It's just a funny moment when the Cher character, played by Silverstone, is explaining to her father that her report card, which is not very impressive, is not done yet, she tells her lawyer father, and that she's still in negotiations with her teachers and hasn't taken the first offer of her grades. And it's a really funny moment in the film. And by the way, don't get any strange ideas about that one. So your grades that you earn are your grades. We're not going to be negotiating them. Just FYI. Okay, let me move on. A couple of romantic films from the 1990s. And some of these would include, by the way, what we would certainly call romantic comedies. Some of these are obviously more romantic dramas. So I've integrated those here. And some of them are kind of a romantic dramedy, if you want to call them that. So some of them are, they have bits and pieces of drama, but also a fair amount of lighthearted interactions. So sometimes referred to as dramedy. So all of these are great. And if you haven't seen them, you need to watch them. And if you and your significant other, right? So if you are, guys, let me just say this. If you think you're going to make it through life and have lasting relationships with a gal and not watch romantic films, you are a moron. You're going to have to figure that one out. So take it from me, some early advice. Start to appreciate the value of these films, and maybe move away from some of the action adventure sci-fi, shoot 'em up set pieces for the occasional film that brings these wonderful realities of our lives into focus and And these films do it very, very well, very convincingly and in entertaining fashion. I I've always actually liked, romantic films and romantic comedies anyway. I think they're actually very clever, going all the way back to the 30s and 40s. So even when I was a junior higher and high schooler, I was surprised at how much I enjoyed some of these. I probably didn't share that with a whole lot of my friends at the time, but it is what it is. And yeah, I appreciated watching how men and women interact and how they fall in love with each other and how they create strong, abiding relationships, and how there is give and take, and how they're often surprising one another, both with the ways they let each other down, but also the ways in which they build one another up, and how they sacrifice for one another, and really how love works. I just think these are great. It's a great genre of film, and I think I think too many macho-ish sort of guys pretend, honestly, that they don't really like romantic films, and I don't really get the point, to be honest with you. So I would highly recommend every one of these. And some of them, in fact, so Sense and Sensibility rightly deserve to be considered for Best Picture Oscar. Sleepless in Seattle got an awful lot of both audience and critical attention, and rightly so. Every one of the films on this screen deserve to be watched, and watched time and time and time again. Very clever. I have some personal favorites. I love Notting Hill. I absolutely adore French Kiss. I think the Kevin Kline character, he plays a Frenchman in the film. He's just off the charts hilarious. and Meg Ryan is fantastic in that film. I love Meg Ryan and Tom Hanks whenever they're paired in romantic comedy films. The two great ones from the 1990s that they're in together are, of course, Sleepless in Seattle from 1993 and You've Got Mail from 1998. Very clever. You've Got Mail is an updated film from a World War II era film called The Shop Around the Corner. And I honestly prefer the remake. Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan are brilliant in the film, and the script writing was perfect for their acting capabilities. Jack Nicholson and Helen Hunt are fantastic in As Good as It Gets. And Greg Kinnear is also wonderful in that film. Blast from the Past, we just had an Alicia Silverstone film with Clueless, and I think she is as good or maybe better in Blast from the Past. And although I don't often appreciate some of the films that Brendan Fraser's in, he is really great in this film, and it works at just about every level. About a young man named Adam, who, by the way, meets this young woman named Eve, played by Alicia Silverstone, after he has been down below ground in a fallout shelter because his parents thought that nuclear war had broken out in October of 1962. And so he comes back up to the surface. He and his family start to prepare to leave that fallout shelter, but they have to discover whether life is still in existence up above. And it's a funny set piece for a film that is also very, very clever. The romance between the two is certainly very lighthearted at times, but also very typical of 1990s banter back and forth. And it's a really funny, clever set piece set in LA of the 1990s. Really fun film. Sabrina is also a remake. I like the 1990s version. This one was a 1995 film as well, starring Harrison Ford and Julia Ormond in the two title roles. But it's a remake of one of my absolute all-time favorite films, so it's hard for me to like, because the original, in my opinion, is so much better, with Humphrey Bogart and Audrey Hepburn and William Holden in the title roles all the way back in 1954. But it would be wrong to suggest that Sabrina, the remake, is not good. It is a good film. Notting Hill, I just mentioned it in passing. Man, that is a film that I go back to again and again. In my opinion, it is one of Hugh Grant's most endearing roles, and I think Julia Roberts just shines in that film. She's so wonderful. And the storyline is clever. This internationally renowned actress, right, Julia Roberts' character in the film, ends up falling for this little shop owner in the Notting Hill district of London. And it is just a funny, engaging film at just about every level. I love it. I think it should have gotten a whole lot more attention from the Academy in 1999 when it came out. Going back to Sense and Sensibility, though, I just want to mention it in passing because it is the one I posted a clip for. So this is Ang Lee, one of the great directors of the modern era. Ang Lee's effort to kind of dabble in, romantic filmmaking, and he's done a number of other really interesting films over the years. But I really love the cinematography for this film, and actually some of the BBC television series that went back and did Sense and Sensibility, for instance, they actually borrowed heavily from the ways in which Ang Lee constructs the early 19th century British culture and brings it to the screen effectively. Again, a 1995 film. I don't know what it was about 1995. What a fantastic year. That's the year my wife and I finished university and then got married in the fall of that year. So 1995, spectacular year. Toy Story also came out that year, and I'm not going to talk about it, but I wish I had more time to do so. So all these great films of 1995, all these spectacular events, very groundbreaking scenarios, right? So the Bruce marriage that started in 1995 is coming up on 25 years, so that's something to celebrate. Woohoo! So Sense and Sensibility, I love the set pieces. The characters are well loved. Anyone who's read Jane Austen would be familiar, obviously, with those characters and with the plot line, and yet bringing it to the silver screen in a new way and in a very engaging way was something of an accomplishment. And the reason is this, that those novels are very complex and layered, as Jane Austen intended them to be, and oftentimes it's very difficult to compress them into a 2-hour framework. And others had tried and kind of had minimal or moderate success, perhaps, but nothing like this. And to be honest with you, it is definitely a compression of the novel. So you'll find that there are genuine differences between, key differences, in fact, in the storyline and the plot lines and how they're moving and how they're brought together from the Jane Austen novel versus the Ang Lee film. And yet it works beautifully. Emma Thompson plays the key character, the protagonist in the film, Eleanor. Her sister, Marianne, is played by a very young Kate Winslet. She's just wonderful in this film. This is the reason, by the way, that James Cameron cast her a year or so later as they began filming for his film Titanic. He was enthralled by Kate Winslet's performance in Sense and Sensibility and thought that she was just perfect as a romantic counter to a male lead in a film. And there's good reason for that. Also, you have you have Hugh Grant in the film. He's wonderful. Alan Rickman, of all things, Alan Rickman is in Sense and Sensibility, and for one of the few times in his career, he's not playing a villain. So, and in fact, he plays Colonel Brandon in the film, and a very much a courageous, noble, virtuous character. And I love Alan Rickman in that role in this film. And it's one of the films I go back and watch actually sometimes just because I want to see Alan Rickman in a role that he rarely played, in a kind of role that he rarely played. So I posted for you the link to Sense and Sensibility, where Edward Ferrars comes back and he finally tells Eleanor that he in fact is not married. All the news that she has heard about him, about his life, that in fact those are false rumors, and he tells her that in fact he is available, that he is actually the two of them, they have not been able to engage in a romantic relationship for all sorts of reasons that were foundational to British culture at that time. Some of them very good reasons, in fact. And yet we are just longing for both of them to find one another and to find this sense of happiness and contentment, and for their very clear feelings of love and affection to finally come to fruition. And it's a really well done film. I love it. I hope you have an opportunity to see it at some time in the near future. Okay. A couple of war films I'm just going to mention. I did not post any links. We've already talked about Saving Private Ryan. One of the great American Civil War films comes out in the 1990s. I want you to know going in that this is excuse me, I'm going to take a sip of coffee because my throat's dry here. This is a film, Gettysburg, all right. This is a film which takes the 3-day battle and actually brings it to life in a way that I thought was just profoundly useful, helpful from a historical, contextual framework, but also very effective as far as a dramatic set piece. The performances in the film are really great. I love Martin Sheen as Robert E. Lee. Jeff Daniels shines as Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, the lieutenant colonel of the 20th Maine Regiment. Tom Berenger is fabulous as Longstreet, one of Robert E. Lee's favored generals. And it's a very effective film, but it's 4 hours and 15 minutes. It's definitely a throwback. I remember watching it actually in the theaters thinking, holy cow, you know, we got to the 2.5 hour time frame and all of a sudden it said intermission on the screen, which I'd never been in a theater to see other than when they redid Gone with the Wind and Lawrence of Arabia. So those are the only other 2 films I'd seen in a theater where they had an intermission. And I was thinking, wow, this is crazy. But it's a really good film. So I want you to be aware of it. Just know going in, if you were to watch it, it's almost 4 hours and 15 minutes. Courage Under Fire, great modern warfare film at the time, comes out in the 1990s, and it deals very effectively with the realities of modern warfare. And one of the things that it does particularly well, this is an Ed Zwick film, by the way, starring Denzel Washington, one of the absolute treasures of acting of the past 30 years, 35 years even. Denzel Washington and Meg Ryan are both excellent in the film. Matt Damon, a young Matt Damon, is in this film as well. He does a very fine job. Anyway, this film does a really good, it brings the realities of memory and how human beings construct memory very haphazardly at times. And so it's very difficult sometimes to get at the heart and core of what actually happened. So historians like me love this film because we're always trying to delve into the realities of human memory. And so the Denzel Washington character is charged with trying to determine whether a Medal of Honor nominee, played by Meg Ryan, whether this woman who was killed in combat, whether she actually deserves to be awarded the Medal of Honor due to her service in the Iraq War. And it's it's dramatic. There's a lot going on in this story. It's very well told, and I think you'll appreciate that. We've talked about Saving Private Ryan, so I don't need to say much more about that here. The other film, and I think for me, it's the other great war film of the 1990s. It is Terrence Malick's The Thin Red Line. And man alive, what a film. There are times when I'm not sure if I prefer, Saving Private Ryan or The Thin Red Line as far as, masterpieces of war films go. Thin Red Line is visceral. There's a lot of emotion in it. It integrates the surrounding environment, as all Malick films do. It integrates the surrounding environment thoroughly and well, beautifully. It is thoughtful. There are these poignant moments of beauty and even moments where the characters, especially the lead character, or one of the lead characters played by Jim Caviezel, where it's almost prayerful, contemplative in that sense. And yet, what he does so effectively in the film, Malick juxtaposes the peaceful and the poignant and the noble and the thoughtful with the traumatic and disturbing and just horrifying realities of World War II in the Pacific Theater. and he brings it together in just some of the most moving and beautiful, and also obviously shattering scenes regarding the Pacific War. I would highly recommend it to you, but I want you to hear from me again that, like all Malick films, the focus is not on very traditional or typical dialogue. There is dialogue in the film, but he prefers to deal in a very visual foundation first and foremost, and to integrate both the human beings, but also bring them into their natural environment, the scenery, the wildlife. In this case, the indigenous peoples and nearby Pacific Island groups are brought in very beautifully and movingly into the storyline. Man alive, it is a phenomenal film. So I would highly recommend it to you. Sci-fi films, man, again, take your pick. They're all great. I put as many as I could on this screen. There were a few I left off, but 1990s, again, the reason we had to spend 3 full class periods and nearly 3 hours of me talking about the 1990s is because it's just so full of wonderful films. And all of these on the screen certainly fit that framework. Groundhog Day could technically kind of fall into a fantasy framework. So I kind of included sci-fi and fantasy films. I didn't want to, kind of lock myself in too much. All of these phenomenally well done films, really clever. The directors are all working at a very high level with these movies. Gary Ross, certainly one of the great directors who doesn't often get as much attention as he probably should. With Pleasantville, I think he's great. Peter Weir with The Truman Show. Many of you have watched that film and reviewed it for me. I know you love it. Jurassic Park, we've talked about. Terminator 2. Gattaca, I think, an underappreciated film, much more of an intellectual science fiction piece dealing with the ethics of genetic engineering, very effectively done. Edward Scissorhands, one of the great Tim Burton films, starring Johnny Depp, much younger Johnny Depp. All of these have a lot of virtues. But if there's a film that stands out in this of the sci-fi, there, certainly you could make the argument for Terminator 2 and Jurassic Park. Fine and good. I would certainly argue their merits myself. I love both those films, and I think they're impressively made. But if there's a film that was kind of a surprise to the scene, it is the Wachowski brothers' Matrix, which comes out in the spring of 1999, and it is a highly effective film because it integrates not only the best aspects of sci-fi with these avant-garde concepts of human existence, and it certainly does that, especially the question between what is real versus what is an alternative reality. It does that. It has that duality that is set up very effectively in the film. It also has all sorts of questions of postmodernism and existentialism that it is wrestling with, that the characters are wrestling with. It has components of what the advantages of technology may be, but also some of the dangers and limitations of technology that really comes to play in the film very effectively. And it weaves all of these elements together very cleverly and with some really impressive visual set pieces. And although, to this point or to that point, I had never really been impressed with Keanu Reeves. I have to admit that character, he was able to bring that character to life very effectively. I love Lawrence Fishburne in that film as Morpheus. I think he's actually really, really wonderful. So there are some really great performances, and I think that the performers themselves obviously are benefiting from a wonderful script and from some wonderful set pieces that they're allowed to take part in. If you haven't seen the film, you also should be aware, if you're wanting to watch it, or if you were to watch a clip, that it is certainly violent. And yet I love how the violence is staged very carefully. You have a difference between kind of a video game violence that you see in this world that they call the Matrix, which is false, a false world, versus the violence of the real world that they're living in, which actually exists hundreds and hundreds of years later than they think. And so, or 150 or 200 years later than they think. And all of it is just marvelously constructed. And for me, if I were forced to choose a sci-fi fantasy film of the 1990s that has stood the test of time, the best, that has garnered the most attention, that audiences still to this day just flock back to, that would probably be my pick. Although I think these other films, particularly Terminator 2 and Jurassic Park, are films that audiences the world over also continue to flock back to. In passing, I should mention both The Fifth Element and 12 Monkeys, very clever, but kind of, they have sort of a more avant-garde, independent film flavor to them, but they're also very clever. 12 Monkeys is just, I think, one of my favorite surprise sci-fi films of the 1990s. And I love Madeline Stowe and Bruce Willis in the film, and yet the character, the actor who takes the cake, who gets the most attention, and rightly so, is Brad Pitt, who plays this increasingly insane character in the film and just does a really fantastic job with it. So all of these are great films. When you watch the Matrix clip, I just couldn't help posting the clip where Morpheus and Neo go into the Matrix and spar. So it's a sparring scene where they're, where everybody's kung fu fighting, for lack of a better phrase. And it's a brilliantly constructed piece. And I think what I appreciate most about that is that the Wachowskis and their production team do a phenomenal job, really a very effective job of using technology to tell their story, but not overdoing the technology. It has to be subtly done. A lot of films that have come out in the past 25 years or more have been over-reliant on the use of CGI to the point where it's actually detracted from the storyline. And one of the things I really do love about The Matrix is that they were very careful and very clever with how they integrated the availability of of emerging visual technologies to make their story pop and to really work, but to not overwhelm the story, the characterization, and the performances of their actors. So yeah, Matrix, man, what a film. And I love that sequence. And in fact, I love just the start of that sequence where Neo has been plugged in and they're uploading all of this, all of these abilities into his mind. And so he opens his eyes and he, in the famous Keanu Reeves voice, he says, "I know Kung Fu." And he's ready to go, right? And just a phenomenal moment in the film. Really love it. And Keanu Reeves continues, if he's in the right kind of role, Keanu Reeves can really make his characters work. One of the guys on the floor where I lived at Taylor University, named Derek Kolstad, by the way. Derek is the creator of John Wick, and I think that the John Wick character is perfectly suited to Keanu Reeves. He has taken that one and made it his own, and he's very convincing in that role. And so given the right kind of character, I think Keanu Reeves works perfectly well. Sometimes that doesn't come about. He's taken on some very strange roles over the years, but I have come to respect him more, especially when he takes on the roles that he knows he can play well. All right, guys, that's it for me. And I will be moving forward with some other stuff, but for right now, that's our time. And I hope you guys are all doing well. We will talk soon. Bye-bye.